In this lecture, we'll be examining the origins of the British East India Company. From relatively humble beginnings, the EIC eventually handled approximately half of global trade by the 19th century. The EIC, though, faced entrenched rivals and fierce competition when it launched its first voyages. The beginnings of English overseas trade and expansion have their roots in the voyages of English privateers. As discussed in other lectures, one person's privateer is another person's pirate, but the English monarchs certainly tolerated and in many cases authorized attacks on Spanish and Portuguese shipping in the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most famous privateer episodes involved an English fleet organized by Sir Walter Raleigh in 1592, and English Queen Elizabeth I was actually the principal investor of this expedition. Raleigh's ships were cruising near the Azores Islands, where they hoped to intercept a Spanish treasure fleet coming back from the New World. Instead, the ships encountered the 1,600-ton Madre de Deus, a Portuguese dhow, returning from India laden with spices, precious stones, and other luxury goods. The ship's name translates as Mother of God. The cargo at the time had a value of over £500,000 English pounds. In 2014 the value of this cargo would be something like $5 billion US dollars. Unfortunately for Elizabeth I, although she received quite a windfall from the voyage, there was a lot of looting when they brought the ship ashore. The image on this slide is a 19th century depiction of the 1592 Battle of Flores that ended with the capture of the Madre de Deus. One of the keys to English successes overseas was the acquisition of quality intelligence on Indian Ocean trade networks and political alignments. Ralph Fitch was a London merchant who led a group of merchants on a trade embassy that left in 1583. On the accompanying map, the red indicates the route Fitch took at the start of his travels, while the blue lines indicate his return travels. For several months, Fitch and several of his companions were detained by the Portuguese at Ormuz, the strategic point they held at the southern end of the Persian Gulf. After being freed, Fitch traveled to India, where he reached the court of the Mughal Emperor Akbar. He later traveled to present-day Burma, Malaysia, Sumatra, and Ceylon, before returning back to England in 1591 after 8 years overseas. Fitch wrote down his observations and later served as a consultant to English merchant Sir Thomas Smythe, the first governor of the East India Company. Recognizing the profit potential in overseas trade, Elizabeth I issued a royal charter in 1600 for a 15-year monopoly to what was known then as the Governor and Company of the Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. The company initially had 125 shareholders who invested £72,000 into the venture. By comparison, this would be about $750 million US dollars in 2014. The EIC was managed by a governor and a 24-person board of directors. The internal structure of the EIC was influenced to some extent by the Dutch East India Company, though early on the EIC did not approach voyages as permanent endeavors. Typically, in the company's first decade, all vessels and supplies would be sold off after the voyage to be combined with all remaining cash to repay investors after voyages. It was not until 1614 that the permanent joint stock model would be used and permanent company infrastructure would be established. James Lancaster led the first official EIC voyage to the Indian Ocean basin in 1601. His fleet consisted of 5 vessels and cost £40,000 to outfit. This is a little less than $500 million US dollars in 2014. The initial investment included the purchase of English goods to sell overseas, plus the necessary capital to purchase goods in the Spice Islands. Lancaster and his crew reached the islands of Java and Sumatra, and they established the first EIC factory at Bantam. This first voyage was quite profitable, and Lancaster returned with a valuable cargo of spices in September 1603. As a reward for his services, Lancaster was knighted by Elizabeth I, and he later became an EIC director. The English believed that they needed a diversified approach to better compete with other European powers, and they decided to employ diplomacy to strengthen their presence in the Indian Ocean basin. Thomas Roe was an English diplomat who traveled to the court of the Mughal emperor in 1614. As a result of his patience and negotiating skill, Roe obtained protection for an English factory at the city of Surat on the western coast of India. This was the first permanent English presence in the Indian subcontinent. Yet despite early gains, the Dutch were sending out over 5 times as many ships to the Indies as the English by 1625. Like the Dutch, the English also saw opportunities in the far-flung Portuguese Estado de India. The English began attacking Estado ships in 1612. In 1614, the English duped the commander of a large Portuguese fleet into thinking they were more powerful than their Portuguese counterparts. In 1615, EIC ships defeated a large Portuguese fleet, and between English and Dutch victories in the ensuing decades, it was clear the Portuguese were no longer the dominant power in the Indian Ocean basin. The image on this slide is a depiction of the Battle of Swally Hole in 1612 near the city of Surat. This battle was not only an English military victory, but it also impressed the Mughal emperor, which helped English diplomatic efforts. Between 1615 and 1628, the number of ships making the Surat-London run increased from 1 to 7 per year. In 1622, the English allied with the Persians, and they defeated the Portuguese at Keshem, as well as in a pivotal battle to control the Strait of Ormuz, which you can see depicted on this slide. This gave the English control of one of the most strategically important waterways in the world, and the British, either directly or indirectly, held on to this choke point until well into the 20th century. As discussed in a previous lecture, in 1605 the Dutch conquered the Portuguese fort on the island of Amboina. This island had been one of the leading growers of clove trees in the world, a highly prized spice. The British resented the Dutch efforts to monopolize clove production and sought to gain entry in the clove markets. In the 1619 Treaty of Defense, the English and Dutch East India Companies agreed to provide mutual military aid against indigenous powers. However, repeated violations of the treaty created friction between the English and the Dutch. The Dutch, on their part, accused the British of causing trouble with the Sultan of Ternate, one of the major powers in the region. Dutch officials became somewhat paranoid that the English were plotting to overthrow them on Amboina. An English soldier was captured and tortured by the Dutch, and to end the torture, he implicated fellow British officials. The image on this slide is a 17th century illustration from an English account of the torture of EIC employees by Dutch interrogators. In response, 20 English East India Company employees were executed by the Dutch. This incident was a source of conflict between the English and the Dutch for the better part of a century. The map accompanying this slide depicts the major EIC factories in operation by 1639. While still facing significant challenges by the Dutch and Portuguese, and very soon by the French, the English EIC slowly began building a network of bases from which to project power and increase their overseas trade. In the middle of the 17th century, the EIC faced a number of challenges, some of which threatened the very continued existence of the company. In the 1630s, King Charles I granted charters to a merchant group known as the Courten Associates, Courten, sometimes spelled Courteen, which broke the EIC monopoly on trade in the Indies. During the reigns of James I and Charles I, both kings faced financial difficulties, and both monarchs did their best to maximize the revenue that they could extract from the EIC. Even greater uncertainty for the EIC occurred during the English Civil Wars from 1640 to 49, the eventual execution of Charles I, and the period of Oliver Cromwell's protectorate. Moreover, the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648 proved to be quite disruptive to overall trade in the Indian Ocean basin, as continental disputes in Europe interfered with trade overseas. It was not until the end of the Cromwell era that the EIC began to recover and to thrive again. In 1657, Oliver Cromwell granted a permanent charter to the EIC, and in 1661 this charter was confirmed by Charles II, the monarch on the restored English throne. In 1661, Charles II received the city of Bombay, which is now Mumbai, as part of a dowry to his bride. You can see her depicted here. That's Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese princess. With its excellent harbor and strategic location on the west central coast of India, Bombay gave the EIC a strong base from which to centralize its operations, and you can't beat the lease price of £10 per year to Charles II, which was quite a bargain even in 17th century standards. Yet more than any other factor, it was the recognition by EIC officials of the profit potential in tea that led to the phenomenal growth of the English East India Company in the 18th century. Tea began to be consumed by many people in the British Isles during the 18th century, and the product became intricately woven into British culture. By the middle of the 18th century, the EIC was exporting millions of pounds of tea per year from ports in Asia, and the power and influence of the EIC grew exponentially. This draws to a close our brief look at the origins of the British East India Company.